Welcome to Orioles on the Verge. This is Zach Spedden, joined as always by Bob Phelan. Our co-host Nick Stevens is out this week, but Bob and I are going to try to hold down the fort as we get into our spring training predictions. And we're going to give you predictions over two parts this week. Part one is going to focus on some of the bigger storylines coming into camp, while part two will be about some of the roster battles that might take place over the coming weeks in the Grapefruit League. And that is all coming up on tonight's episode of Orioles on the Verge, which is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline is the world's most trusted betting platform and your number one source for online betting in 2025. Whether you're a seasoned fan or a first-time bettor, BetOnline is your ultimate game day companion. With the largest selection of odds on everything from NBA and college basketball to the NHL and UFC, BetOnline continues to be your number one sports betting source. From every three-pointer to hat trick, BetOnline has you covered with odds, stats, and more for every game, every play, and every win. BetOnline, the game starts here. Now, over at our Patreon community, we are in the very final days of our top 50 prospects countdown, but it's not too late to join because not only can you get in on the last few episodes, but you can go back and listen to all previous installments of the top 50 countdown, and of course, have access to bonus coverage throughout the regular season from Bob, Nick, and myself. And a few people in the last week have decided to go ahead and do just that and join our Patreon community. And we want to recognize them now. And for that, I will turn it over to Bob.
Yeah, the game starts here as well for these two new patrons who have, they're young. So we're going to start them in single A, and we're going to hope to develop them in our organization. That's Bruce Ferret and Jared Fink. So really appreciate you guys joining up, and I hope you enjoy the content. And we're so close to baseball. I can taste it. I love it. Thank you guys for joining.
And for those who are in our Patreon community, you can look for the reveal of the number one and number two prospects in a single episode this weekend. So keep an eye out for that. We're now going to get into our spring training predictions. This is something we do every year here at Orioles on the Verge. And we decided this year to spread it out a little bit. We're going to do it over two episodes, and we're going to break down some similar stuff to what we've done in the past, as well as some new categories. This first prediction prompt that I'm going to read out is one that we've done every year, but because the expectation is that it will be a minor move, it's usually buried down late in the show. But one of the dominant storylines coming into camp is that the Orioles didn't go out and get an ace to replace Corbin Burnes this offseason. However, with Dylan Cease among some of the other rumored targets still with their current teams, as we go into spring training, I will put out this question. Will we see a move this spring, Bob?
I do think so. Actually, I do think this is a spring training where there was not many other than Garrett Crochet early on in the offseason. And I'm sure there was a couple other ones I'm forgetting, but I feel like, last year, Dylan Cease, I feel like it was either right before spring training or right around there. He was moved. But that is a possibility. I think that the Orioles, speaking of Dylan Cease, could still trade for a guy of his caliber. But I think what we're going to see is similar to what we saw in, I guess, was 2022 preseason with the Cole Sulser, Tanner Scott trade, because I feel like the bullpen is very stabilized right now and very locked on Orioles. Shout out to them. But I feel like with some of these NRIs that are in camp right now, like Rodolfo Martinez, I'm sure we'll get to him, some of the hype coming on with him without even games being played yet. But him, Colin Selby's of the world, Albert Suarez adding a new pitch could be valuable. Like there's almost too many names for the 8-man bullpen. So I would not be shocked if you saw a Cionel Perez and I don't know, name some other reliever, or maybe it's just Cionel Perez, or maybe it's Ramon Arias finally gets moved in the right deal to try to make room for Kobe Mayo. I'm not sure exactly what, but I do think there will be a trade this spring. Maybe it's major, maybe it's minor, but something's coming.
I do think we'll see a move this spring. I don't think it's going to be for a top of the rotation arm. I think that the Orioles will ship out Brian Baker. To your point, they do have a lot of relievers, and right now, as long as everybody stays healthy, I don't think that there's room for Baker on the opening day roster. It's also worth noting that he is out of options, unlike Colin Selby. And you just touched on this, but the Orioles actually have a really interesting group of relievers on their non-roster invitee slate for this spring. So they're going to have depth at AAA. They should have the last spot in the bullpen seemingly locked down as long as everybody stays healthy, which again is always the big if. But as long as everybody gets through camp healthy, I don't think there's going to be room for Baker. And the reason that I think he's going to be moved is that teams are always looking for bullpen help. And say what you will about Brian Baker, he's been an up and down guy for a competitive team in the last couple of years. Someone will give the Orioles something for that to fill a hole in their middle relief. So it might only be cash considerations. It might be for a 4A type player, but I do think we'll see Brian Baker moved before camp's over.
Yeah, that's a good call. I like that a lot because, yeah, I mean, as much as we're hearing he's up to 97, 98 consistently with the fastball, and it's Brian Baker season 3.0, and fan of the guy. He was a guest on our show. Great guy. Great interview. Check it out if you haven't. But yeah, I don't see any way where he's making this team out of spring. And, you know, some teams, even a good team, like we saw what the Dodgers did with Evan Phillips. I mean, he's got arm talent. Some team would probably take a flyer on him. Like you said, it probably wouldn't be anything more than like a international guy and not a highly touted one or a player to be named later. But maybe if it's, you know, Cole Salser and Tanner Scott, Brian Baker and Cielna Perez, maybe that could give you a little bit more in return if anyone's interested in that. Who knows? But I could see something like that happening for sure because, yeah, like Rodolfo Martinez, Cade Stroud, Luis Gonzalez, the list of arms that I want to see get a chance, and I'm sure they will at some point because injuries and poor performance. AAA Norfolk's rotation and bullpen is going to be loaded, and there are going to be a lot of guys that get their shot this year. But hey, why not? If there's some standouts in camp, get them started a little early and clear some space with the trade, like we mentioned here. Next question.
Yep, I'll go to the next one here. Saturday is the first game. Who pitches?
Let's see. I mean, like it matters, right? It's the first game. It'll be 1 or 2 innings by like 8 or 9 different pitchers. I'm gonna say, let's go with Dean Kramer. I think it could be Dean Kramer kick things off, go an inning or 2, and then just get a bunch of these NRIs. Just get them in the games early. Get an early look at them so that you can get them in early, get them in often. I don't think you need to see guys like Gregory Sotos or Anthony Dominguez very often. You could always work with them in the backfields and simulated games and B squads and all that. So yeah, I think you want to see the guys you want good data on against opposing hitters. So I'll go with Kramer and a bunch of non-roster invitees in game 1.
You are right that the first start of spring really doesn't have a lot of significance because you're going to see that pitcher for an inning or 2 at the most. I went back and looked, and Corbin Burns did start the first game of spring for the Orioles last year. So I'll go ahead and say that this year it's Grayson Rodriguez. That could be a little bit of a tease for a prediction that's coming up in the next show. But I'll say that Rodriguez gets the ball against the Pirates on Saturday.
Yeah, I could see it. I think with Burns, it was more just a matter of that's when his days lined up, and it kind of just made sense. And I think that's basically what we're going to see. I haven't been paying attention to who's throwing which days. Like I know Sagano was a little bit late in camp, so I don't think he's probably going to be the guy that gets the ball in just 3 days from now. So yeah, it's pretty good prediction.
Will any prospects impress early in camp?
I think so. Of course, I think, the Orioles might not have one of the top farm systems anymore, but as we've talked about a lot, it's still pretty deep. And especially, there's some really interesting hitting prospects at AAA Norfolk, and pitching prospects. This camp has a headline of its own. I think this 2025 spring training is Samuel Basayo's world, and we are just living in it. I'm starting to go back on my September 2025 debut for Basayo because I don't think it's going to take that long anymore. It's not even just like, oh, he's hitting home runs in batting practice. It's like he's impressing Charlie Morton, 41-year-old veteran pitcher, with how he's framing and receiving the ball behind the plate. That's huge. You're seeing stuff about his maturity, how much he's just quietly improved, like like I said, his maturity, his just leadership skills. It just seems like everything is turning up Basayo, and I could not be more here for it. I can't wait to watch him and I guess read box scores of him, because it is spring training and we don't get a ton of video, but can't wait to see him in action, and I hope he just bangs the door down into a summer debut.
Yeah, it's going to be Basayo. I really do think he's going to have a good spring, and it's got to be a good feeling for him after last year coming in with the arm issue, not being able to catch in spring training, to be able to get behind the plate and catch some of these older pitchers, and of course have the opportunity to get up and hit. Now, I think that every time you have a younger player like this in camp, you're always going to have the caveat of, well, he hit a home run yesterday, but was that against a guy that's going to be in the majors, or against a guy that's going to be in Double-A? It's more often not going to be against a guy that's going to be in Double-A or Triple-A, but really I don't think that that's what matters. What matters is that he's getting this opportunity to show what he can do to his fellow players as well as the coaching staff. And this is a good development opportunity for him. He's going to go back to Norfolk. He's probably going to be there for most of the season. But what he can do for the Orioles over the next month, I think, is going to be really nice for his development. And yeah, I agree with you. I think that we're setting ourselves up to see Basayo have a really big spring.
Yeah, I think it's just the fact that he can play first base, he could DH, even if you have Gary Sanchez, and Samuel Basayo is like just destroying the ball, showing so much improvement defensively, whatever, in AAA. I feel like you could bring him up and work him in at first base DH, occasional starts at catcher, maybe just an emergency third catcher to start things off with his career. But yeah, I think we're in a good position there. And if I was going to pick anyone else who I think potentially could be a nice, pleasant surprise this spring, I would say Enrique Bradfield Jr. I think we're hearing good things about him. I think I saw today he put on like 12 pounds of muscle over the offseason. He's trying to put a little more impact on the ball. Obviously, he's never going to be a slugger by any stretch of the imagination. Would be surprised if he ever had much more than 10 home runs in a season, but certainly doesn't hurt to impact the ball more. And even if it's just pushing balls that you're hitting into the gaps instead of having them get cut off by an outfielder, if it can reach the wall with his speed, that's a triple instead of a double or a long single. So I think Bradfield, between his defense, his speed, and just his ability to take a pitch, take a walk, doesn't swing and miss really at all. He's kind of like Joey Ortiz in that sense. I think he might be a guy that raises some eyebrows as well.
Definitely. And this is a good opportunity for him as well. And he's probably going to start this year back at Double-A, but I do think that the defense is really going to jump out for people, especially if they've not seen Bradfield play before.
Yeah, and maybe Judd Fabian in a similar way, just because, I don't think he got much run last spring training, or at least not a whole bunch if he did. And again, he's got great defense, a really good arm. He might run into a home run against a Double-A quality pitcher that, gets everyone excited, but he's got a little more of a project to go. We talked about him not too long ago on the top 50 countdown. I'm a fan, but I don't think he's like immediate help, but you never know. You run into one. That's all it takes to grab someone's attention in spring training.
We'll talk now about a player who is definitely not going to be opening the season on the Major League roster because he continues to recover from Tommy John surgery, and that is Jorge Mateo. When will we see Mateo this year, and what will his role with the team be?
It's a good question because there's not a ton of room. I'm looking at roster resource, and even with Mateo projected, and after Mike Elias talked to the media, certainly not going to be ready for opening day. Even so, our bench, even without him, is Gary Sanchez, Ramon Arias, Heston Kjerstad, Ramon Laureano, and that has Tyler O'Neill, Colton Cowser, and Cedric Mullins in the outfield. So it will be tough. I don't think, they just signed him to $3 million deal with a team option for the next year, which is almost certainly not going to be exercised. But that's why again, I think this could be the time you see Ramon Urias get traded. Maybe this spring, if an injury pops up for a contender and they need someone to fill in, or God, look at the Yankees, Tampa, like some of the American League East teams, even right now, third base is kind of a weakness. Ramon Urias could slide in there for a bunch of teams. Maybe that's how you fit Kobe Mayo on the roster. Just thinking ahead here, which we're going to talk about, but maybe that's the move. Maybe even if it's not in spring training, if it's okay, we know Mateo's getting close. We want to keep him on the bench. Maybe we shop Arias around before then, but when he's healthy, I guess I think he's just like the last man on the bench who can come in defensively if you need him, or on the base paths. If a lefty's up against Jackson Holiday in a must-win situation, maybe you pinch hit for him. But I'm not the biggest Jorge. I mean, I like Jorge Mateo, but as far as fit on the roster, I'm not sure I completely see it unless it's like the last guy on the bench.
The Orioles have really not given many hints about when we could expect to see Mateo back. Now, keep in mind that position players tend to recover from Tommy John faster than pitchers, but Mateo, being a shortstop utility player, has to get the arm back more. So this is not like a first baseman recovering from Tommy John surgery. We're not going to have to throw that much or not have to make a lot of high velocity throws very often. So let's say he had the surgery, I believe, in August of last year. So we're now 6 months out. I'll say that he comes back late May, early June. Again, without better information, I'm just speculating here. Late May, early June, and by then there will be a spot open, either because of an injury or some other move that happens, and he'll go back to his old role, which is speed and utility type who hits lefties. I think that in the Orioles' ideal scenario, he gets fewer at bats this year than he has in the past, but I don't think we've seen the end of Jorge Mateo in Baltimore, and I think that once he's back, there's going to be a spot for him.
If there's one thing this front office is good at, it's at keeping guys around longer than fans expect them to be around, because they're not a fan of giving up on guys when you don't need to, unless you're forced to, which might be the case at some point this year. But yeah, I tend to agree. Might be a long rehab stint. You know, they might use the full month of rehab for Mateo just to wait for that right opportunity to fit him in. But yeah, I think I completely agree with you.
We'll go now to a different injury we learned about early in camp. Left-handed pitcher Trevor Rogers is not going to begin the season on either the Orioles roster or AAA Norfolk's roster as he recovers from an injury. And Bob, we'll just put this out there. When will we see Trevor Rogers on the mound again, and what will his role be?
We'll see him on the mound, I'll say, around May 1st, early May in AAA Norfolk. And again, I just think he's going to be a guy that you try to, because he has options, you try to get him right, which I know he said he was up to about 93 miles per hour as he was getting ready for spring before he dislocated his knee or whatever the exact name of the injury is. But that's, I think, encouraging because you're not obviously up to full speed when he was up to 93. So there was potentially still some more room to go in the velocity there. So that's nice. But I think you want to see him have some success in AAA before you get ready to call him up to the majors. But if he's healthy, he pitches a good month, maybe by June, depending on, again, the health and who's available. I think Cade Povich and Chase McDermott might be ahead of him at the moment. But if he gets right and starts pitching like he did in 2021, then there's no question they'll try to find a way to get him in the big leagues, whether it's as a starter or a reliever. So I'll say May, he's back in the minors pitching. June or July, potential major league return to the Orioles.
Yeah, I agree with that. And it was a partial dislocation. The right kneecap is the injury that Rogers has. I would say it sounds like he's at least a month behind schedule. So I'm going to say that we don't see him in Norfolk until early May at the earliest. I will go back, though, to something that I said when we had our projection episode recently, which is that I feel like a win for the Orioles at this point with Rogers might be that they have another year of control beyond 2025. Maybe we see him work in a starter's role down in AAA. You stretch him out a little bit, see if he can be an emergency option in the rotation for you. And if not, then maybe you add him to the bullpen down the stretch with an eye towards him pitching full-time in relief in 2026. I know there has been a lot of focus this offseason on him increasing his velocity and improving his pitch mix at the same time, which, you look at that and you could suggest starter, but it never hurts to be a lefty that has more than one weapon out of the bullpen. And especially now coming off the injury, I do wonder if that's still the path for Rodgers. So I think we will see him in the majors, but not until after the All-Star break. And we'll see him in the minors by no earlier than the beginning of May.
Yeah, I do think that the reliever for 2026 thing is a real possibility, but also the Orioles are losing potentially losing, notwithstanding an extension of some kind. Zach Eflin, Sugano, Morton, unless he fake retires again. That's 3 right there. Dean Kramer, you could always upgrade on. So there's potential that they could need him in the rotation at the back end of the rotation in 2026. But hopefully, again, just like this year, you're not coming into the season relying on that. So
that's a good point. Now, I have nothing for this question, which
you
is
didn't take
actually
this
not
quiz?
which is not even a prediction. I don't have anything here, so you're gonna have to fill the space because I got the email to take the Which Oriole Are You personality quiz. I got one question into it, and it came up and it asked me favorite singer. The options were Eric Church, Motley Crue, George Strait, or Cody Johnson. I've got nothing. I can't pick one of those 4 because I just can't. I don't have anything to say about any of them. So I just stopped the quiz right there. I will never know which Oriole I am. But Bob, I take it that you know which Oriole you are.
Kind of. I mean, this was such a terribly run quiz. Like this, there was no thought put into this whatsoever. It was 6 questions, and they were like, if you want to be Colton Cowser, you could make yourself be Colton Cowser because it's like, what's your favorite color? Cow print, orange. Like it was the worst questions ever. And yeah, the musician one, I'm like, I guess Motley Crue because I at least know who they are. George Strait, I know who he is, but I wasn't picking him. So I ended up getting Gunnar Henderson. Like one of the questions is, what's your favorite position? I picked shortstop. What do you know? I ended up with Gunnar Henderson. So yeah, I just thought this was, when I saw the link, I was like, oh, this is cool. And then as soon as it started, I was like, no, this is not cool at all. But just thought we'd throw this question in here anyway.
Yeah, not to get all political, but it was not as high quality as the Which President Are You quiz I took on BuzzFeed in 2014.
Yeah, pick any random personality quiz, and I think it will probably be better than the one the Orioles put out, unfortunately.
The last question for this part of our prediction episodes here for this week. Who will be named the opening day starter? We're not going to wait until the regular season predictions for this one because by then this decision will have been made. And we'll also put this one in the first episode in case we get an announcement early in camp. Now, as I mentioned at the top of the show, the Orioles didn't fill Corbin Burns' spot at the top of the rotation. So you don't have that consensus guy. Like this is clearly who's going to be the opening day starter. But you have seemingly 2 very good candidates to get the assignment this year when the Orioles open up the season in Toronto, which means that the home opener is going to be someone lower in the rotation like Dean Kramer. But nevertheless, opening day, all eyes will be on blank as they take the start for the Orioles.
I'll actually pick who's the opening day starter and who's the home opener starter because why not? I'll start with the home opener. I think it makes too much sense to have Sugano start the home opener. Just be like, here's your home crowd. All eyes are on you internationally. I think this is the most Japan has ever heard of the Orioles is since they signed Sugano, and I think they'll be watching a lot of Orioles games overseas because of it. And why not show off the new left field wall in Camden Yards? Give the fans in attendance, the sold out crowd, a chance to cheer on one of your coolest, newest additions. So that makes sense to me. And especially if he's going to pitch closer to 1 time a week than every 5 days, I think it would be cool to have the first game at home. But as for who is going to start in Toronto for opening day, I think Charlie Morton is a dark horse candidate just because he's a veteran and maybe his days line up as spring training goes on to make the home up or not the home opener, make the opening day start. But no, I think it's between Eflin and Grayson Rodriguez, and I'll go with Eflin just because he pitched so well after the Orioles traded for him. Gave up a lot to get him, but it paid off as far as the results went, and we're going to need him to be just as good this year almost if we want a chance to go far in the playoffs. And maybe they give him the opening day nod as a start the extension talks off a little bit with some sweet talk. Let's here, you want to start opening day for the second year in a row? I think he started opening day for the Rays in 2024. Then hey, then stay in town for another 3 or 4 years afterwards too.
That's a good pick, and that's almost the one I went with. But I'm going to say that Grayson Rodriguez gets to start in Toronto on opening day. It does feel like, even though not everyone else is sold on it yet, the Orioles are starting to kind of elevate Rodriguez as this is going to be our ace. Look at the pitch mix improvements he made over the offseason. I think Eflin would be a very deserving choice for the opening day roster spot or the opening day start. And I would not be the least bit upset if it was him. But I do think the Orioles will go with Rodriguez on March 27th when they open in Toronto. And then the second game will be Eflin. Charlie Morton will get the ball in the third game. And then they'll round it out with Dean Kramer in the finale at Toronto. And then Sugano will get the home opener start against Boston, which apparently will have a giant hole at third base to start this year. I don't know if you heard that or not.
Yeah, I love to see all the behind the scenes issues there in Boston. It's interesting that you sign Alex Bregman, who is a really solid third baseman. You have one of the worst defending third basemen in the league. Amazing hitter. Love Rafael Devers, but he's a butcher with the glove. Yeah, let's move Bregman to second base and leave Devers at third. And then you have their second full season first baseman trying to keep the youngins down, the prospects down, and saying, no, we need these veterans on the team. The young kids have to wait their turn. Love it. I love what's going on in Boston and Toronto. Yeah, it's great.
Absolutely. And, overall, right now, at least in the Orioles clubhouse, the vibes seem good. And that's something we'll talk a little bit more about in part 2 later on this week when we get into more spring training predictions. And the second part is going to focus more on some of the roster battles and how we see them playing out. You're not going to want to miss that. In the meantime, you can check us out on our many social media channels, including Facebook, Instagram, Threads, X, TikTok, YouTube, Blue Sky, and Twitch. We're also over at Substack, OriolesOnTheVerge.substack.com. And while you're browsing around the internet, be sure to join our Patreon community, get in on the final days of our Top 50 Prospects Countdown, and give yourself access to bonus daily coverage or bonus coverage throughout the season. For Bob Phil and Nick Stevens, this is Zach Spedden. You've been listening to Orioles on the Verge, presented by BetOnline and part of the Believe Podcast Network. Welcome to Orioles on the Verge. This is Zach Spedden, joined as always by Bob Phelan. Our co-host Nick Stevens is out this week, but Bob and I are back again to talk about spring training predictions as we get into part 2 of forecasting what we think is going to happen in Sarasota over the next month or so. This episode, we're going to break down some of the position battles. Will Kobe Mayo, a top prospect, make the Orioles opening day roster? Which outfielders will go north with the team? How will the pitching staff shake out? All of those questions and more will be on tonight's episode of Orioles on the Verge, which is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline is the world's most trusted betting platform and your number one source for online betting in 2025. Whether you're a seasoned fan or a first-time bettor, BetOnline is your ultimate game day companion. With the largest selection of odds on everything from NBA and college basketball to the NHL and UFC, BetOnline continues to be your number one sports betting source. From every three-pointer to hat trick, BetOnline has you covered with odds, stats, and more for every game, every play, and every win. BetOnline, the game starts here. And Bob, I think we'll just go ahead and jump right in here with this first prediction. In the last couple of years, we've had a lot of buzz surrounding a top prospect coming into camp and a lot of hopes that player was going to make the roster, only for it to not happen and Orioles social media to explode. This year, that might or might not happen again with Kobe Mayo. Does Kobe Mayo make the Orioles opening day roster?
I think he's going to make the Orioles' job incredibly difficult, one way or the other. I know that much. I saw an amazing tweet slash skeet blue sky post that from, I believe it was Jake Rill, talking about Kobe Mayo's batting practice session today and how he hit ball over. No, it was Brendan Mortensen, excuse me, from Masson All Access. He hit a ball well over the left field wall, clearing whatever mile marker that it's out there. And then he followed it up with, he just did it again three times in a row. So I think Kobe Mayo is there to prove a point this year. He's still working out mostly, if not exclusively, at third base so far this spring, which obviously hard to find room for him there at the beginning of the season. But I think it says a lot that they still believe in the glove there. They think it will make him a more valuable player, and it will. You can always, I mean, he knows how to play first base. I don't think that's going to be a tough switch if and when he needs to, whether it's temporary or permanent. To answer the question, I have a hard time with how the roster is currently constructed, seeing where he fits in, but at the same time, I have faith that the Orioles are going to find a way to make him eligible for that Rookie of the Year bonus draft pick at the end of the year. So I'm going to play a little bit of a middle game where I think he's going to have a great spring. I think he's going to impress a lot of people and piss off a lot of fans when the Orioles don't bring him way north to Toronto for the opening series. But I think he will be brought up to the team, similar to Jackson Holiday last year and Grayson Rodriguez the year before that, before the deadline, to make him eligible for the Rookie of the Year draft pick. So I think a week into the season, they'll find a way, whether it's an injury or a trade or what have you. I think they'll find a way to make him eligible for that pick. But to hedge my bets, I will say he does not make the opening day roster officially.
That's kind of where I fall on this too. I do think that he's going to put together a nice spring, and with that loud power, he's going to be generating a lot of buzz. There's going to be a lot of discussion about Ramon Urias if Kobe Mayo doesn't make the roster, and I get that, but I actually feel like Mayo's chances of making the team were hurt more by the fact that the Orioles did not move on from Ryan Mountcastle this offseason. That seemed like Mayo's most logical opening was if the Orioles would flip Mountcastle and not acquire anybody else to play first base outside of maybe putting Tyler O'Neill there from time to time. That would be where Mayo gets in. But I think the Orioles do believe that Mountcastle can bounce back a little bit with the wall moving in. And you do have Urias there who's going to play some third base and can play first base in emergencies. So for the time being, I don't see Mayo cracking the opening day roster. With that said, I do agree with you that if the Orioles really believe that he has a shot at winning Rookie of the Year, they'll find a way to get him up early in the year. And I don't know exactly what that window is, and he would have to be up, but they'll find a way to get him in there. And I just did a little bit of looking ahead to the Orioles' first two opponents, the Blue Jays and the Red Sox, in the regular season. Between the two teams, their projected rotations only have one lefty, and that's Garrett Crochet. And we know that the lefty-heavy pitching stats of the teams that the Orioles faced last year were a factor in Jackson Holiday being held back, or at least that's long been speculated. So in this case, there's going to be a lot of righties on the mound, which probably means a lot of at-bats for Heston Kjerstad and Ryan O'Hearn early on. I haven't gone far enough out into the Orioles schedule to see when they'll start facing more lefties, but that's something to keep in mind. So I think Mayo starts the year down in Norfolk, but finds his way to the majors before too long.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. And, I could see them making that trade that we talked about in the first half of this prediction preview for spring training whether it is a Mountcastle or Urias. If I feel like if you trade one of them, then all of a sudden I see the opening for Mayo. Obviously, if Mountcastle's traded, he's the right-handed platoon partner for Ryan O'Hearn, at least early on until Mayo, gets settled in. Then I think he'll be mostly an everyday guy. But even if Urias is traded, and if they still have him working out at their base, maybe that's the reason you do that. And then when you're facing a lefty, you can slide Westberg over to second base if they feel like Holiday needs to be platooned at least early on the season, and then Mayo finds bets at third base or DH or what have you. So yeah, I think I'm not ruling it out. I think it could easily be a Colton Cowser situation where he's just great in spring training, and it's like, all right, you found your way onto the opening day roster, and then you got to earn some regular playing time from there, which Cowser did, and I think Mayo would do as well. So yeah, I'm excited to see how the spring goes. Unfortunately, I think a lot of it is just completely out of his hands, no matter how he performs in the spring. It's more about what the Orioles decide to do with the roster construction and if there are any injuries. But I think he's going to do everything in his power to make it.
I will say this, though, after back-to-back off seasons where Mike Elias kind of teased the possibility of a big prospect making the opening day roster, Grayson Rodriguez before the 23 season and Jackson Holiday before last year, it was kind of nice to see that talk on the back burner this offseason. I think it kind of cooled the temperature a little bit among the fan base. So, I know that there's going to be people upset, and rightfully so, if Mayo has a good camp and doesn't make the opening day roster, but at least the Orioles have not come out and set the expectation that there's a job there for him to lose.
Yeah, that's a good call there. I think, maybe he learned from why am I putting this pressure on myself needlessly? Mike Elias. We know I'm a member of the Mike Elias cult, as some of our biggest fans will tell you. But maybe he doesn't need to make semi promises that he doesn't intend in keeping. But yeah, I think keeping it open ended is the right way to go.
We talked about this player a little bit on our last episode, but let's get into some hypothetical numbers here, or possible numbers. How many home runs will Samuel Basallo hit this spring?
Oh, it's interesting. I think he's going to be playing a decent amount, but I don't expect him to make. I mean, wouldn't it be crazy if he ends up being the prospect that makes it to opening day in 2025 instead of 2026? But I'll say 4. I'll say he'll hit 4 home runs, which is a decent amount for spring training that you're not playing every day. You're getting limited at bats early on. I think that the year Heston Kjerstad had was like 2023. I think he had 3 home runs, 3 or 4 that spring training, and that was enough to get everyone riled up to see him. So yeah, I'll say 4. Be optimistic. He could go Jake Fox with 6 or 7, but I think 4 is what I will say.
I'll go with 2. So I think he gets a hold of a couple, and I think that they're both tape measure shots. But I don't know how many at bats he gets, so I'll hedge a little bit and say 2.
Yeah, and regardless of how many home runs he hits, like I said in the first half of this episode series, this is Samuel Basallo spring training. You might as well call it, instead of ST for spring training, SB, because it's Basallo is the star. Everyone else is just along for the ride. That's the vibe I'm getting. And like I said, I think we're going to leave spring training and be like, when is that guy going to be up in the majors to help this team? Even though the offense is already elite as it is, I just think he's special. He's a special player and prospect.
On a different note, now we'll focus on some of the more established players on the roster and try to figure out which of them are going to make the team. Which outfielders will make the opening day roster?
Yeah, I don't think there's much surprises here in the outfield because, and I'll go to roster resource on Fangraphs. I think they do a really good job of keeping track of this stuff, but they have Tyler O'Neill, Colton Cowser, Cedric Mullins, Heston Kjerstad, and Ramon Laureano. And I think I completely agree with them. I think most days you're going to have Cowser in left, Mullins in center, O'Neill in right. at least against right-handed pitching. And then Heston Kjerstad, DH, with Ryan O'Hearn at first base. I think that makes sense to me. And then when there's a lefty on the mound, you shift Cowser over to center field and you move Laureano into left. Maybe you give O'Neill some DH days against lefties. He can focus on hitting, and you move Kjerstad in the right in those circumstances. But I think 5 outfielders, and those 5 outfielders in particular, make a ton of sense. I think you're going to see Mullins come in when he's not starting, coming in late for speed and defense. And then, if we need some offense late in a game when a lefty comes in, you see Laureano pinch hit for him, and you can move Cowser to center in that situation as well. It's a nice benefit when you have 2 guys who can play a really, really good center field in the way Mullins and Cowser can. So, yeah, I think the platoons and the, using the left-handed versus right-handed pitchers, that kind of thing that Hyde loves to do, I think he's in a perfect situation to do it even more this year to kind of maximize the value of that.
Yeah, I have Cowser, Mullins, O'Neill, Kjerstad, and Laureano as my opening day outfielders as well. I don't know that we'll see Kjerstad in the outfield a ton this year. I think that it's mainly going to be limited to right field, especially at Camden Yards. I really hope we don't see him in left field, even with the wall moving in. It does dawn on me, though, that we never really took the opportunity to talk about the Laureano signing when it happened. I think we had other topics planned that week and just didn't really change course. For what Ramon Laureano is, which is a backup outfielder, I like the move for the Orioles. He's probably going to play once or twice a week in an ideal situation. He hits lefties well, and although I don't expect what he did in Atlanta in the second half last year to carry over, he's going to come back down to earth a little bit. Still a good defender, got a good arm in the outfield, can hit lefties. That's really all you need him to do. If someone gets hurt, that's a problem you can't really expect him to solve. But I do think that Laureano is a nice pickup. And what this also does is leaves the first guy off my list, Dylan Carlson, with an opportunity to get regular at-bats in Norfolk. I do think that that was a little bit of a development move for the Orioles where they wanted to see, okay, can we unlock something here? And I don't know how much you could realistically unlock from the bench at the major league level, but he has multiple options and multiple years of team control remaining. So if he goes down to Norfolk and plays in their outfield every day and hits really well over the first couple months of the season, I'll take that as a sign that maybe the Orioles, have at least gotten Dylan Carlson back to the point where he can be a serviceable major league option. But for now, they're in a good position. They don't have to have him try to be that guy from day one this season.
Yeah, I love the Laureano signing quite a bit. I feel like if you are an Austin Hayes fan, you should definitely be a Ramon Laureano fan because he's going to hit lefties. He's got an amazing arm from the outfield. He's play a solid corner outfield. I don't think he can really play center as much. He could stand there if you need him to, but he's basically Austin Hayes, I feel like, for a cheaper amount and less name recognition for Orioles fans, at least. And from what I've been able to tell, and much better, and I know Austin Hayes had his fans in the clubhouse, but I feel like Ramon Laureano gets just perfect marks for clubhouse chemistry and being a guy that can get fired up, but has a good personality as well. So I just think he's an amazing fit for this team. And, Rubenstein said recently that money is not an issue. So a 1-year, $4 million deal, if it's not working out, you DFA him and then you bring up Carlson or whoever, Daz Cameron, plenty of options in the outfield down in AAA. I think the outfield in Norfolk is going to be pretty loaded between Carlson, Cameron. You got Jordan Adams, Nick Gordon, Dylan Beavers, Judd Fabian, Franklin Barreto, and Hudson Haskin all vying for playing time down there. So, yeah, if it's not working out, no big deal. But I think it was a really, really smart move. And I know that the Orioles fans don't want to hear, depth at starting pitching, depth in the lineup. But depth is important. And it helps you withstand injuries and poor performance. So I liked it a lot. And I think your point about Dylan Carlson is a really good one. I think he is a project play. And if they can even get him to like 100 to 110 WRC plus type of hitter, again, that's an excellent reserve outfielder that you have under control.
We'll turn our attention to the non-roster invitees in camp this spring. And as we talked about in our last episode, there's some pretty interesting bullpen arms in the mix there. You have Rodolfo Martinez, who's generating a lot of buzz early in camp. Raul Alcantara, who Nick has written about several times, a lefty with good stuff that you should definitely have your eye on. Matt Bowman, who actually did a pretty good job for the Orioles late last year out of the bullpen, is in camp as a non-roster invitee and could be depth for them at some point during the season. And if you want to learn more about some of the non-roster guys, you can go back to one of our episodes last week where we broke them down. But you have some interesting names on the pitcher side. Some of the outfielders that Bob just mentioned are in camp as non-roster invitees. Not to mention you have Emmanuel Rivera, who was on the Orioles over the final month or so of last season in camp as a non-roster invitee. So the question here is, does anybody from that group break through and make the opening day roster?
I think it's going to be tough unless there's that trade that we talked about before out of the bullpen, whether it's Brian Baker, Cionel Perez, the combination of something like that. I'm having a hard time seeing it. I think there will be a lot of guys from the non-roster invite that impress and that are on the tips of the team's tongue when it comes to who's going to be the first guy up when needed, whether it's, Keegan Aiken has an option. We need an arm, send him down for the minimum, bring up Raul Alcantara or forgetting his first name, Robinson Martinez, Rodolfo Martinez. I think these guys are going to be right there. Same with Cade Stroud and Luis Gonzalez, as talked about before. If one was going to make it, I will say Raul Alcantara, because if Cionel Perez is traded, I think you might want that extra left-handed pitcher, and he throws heat. He's got some good stuff, but at the same time, Rodolfo Martinez is dancing away at spring training, talking about how he hit 104 on the gun last year. He sits between 100 and 102 miles per hour. He's got a 4-pitch mix. Like, this guy sounds like the find of the century if he lives up to the hype once the games start being played. So I think it would be cool if one did, but I think they'll make the team, just not out of spring training necessarily.
Yeah, there are some players on this list that I do think could contribute to the team in 2025, and I think will contribute to the team in 2025, but I don't see that happening out of spring training for some of the reasons you just mentioned, and not to mention, too, that you have some guys who are on the 40-man roster that you could plug in if there's an injury. So if someone goes down the bullpen, you would still have Brian Baker around at that point if he's not moved. He could get that spot. If it's not him, you have Colin Selby. If you need an extra outfielder, you have Dylan Carlson there. You have Kobe Mayo on the 40-man roster. So the point being there that the 40-man roster is kind of deep right now with the lack of injury. So if someone does go down, I think you're going to see the Orioles plug in from that group. And even if you have something happen in the rotation, you still have Cade Povich on the 40-man. So there's a lot of flexibility on the 40-man roster in that area right now. So I don't think they need to go with someone from the non-roster invitee slate, but I agree with you that multiple players from that group could end up contributing to the major league team.
Yeah, I'd be surprised if they didn't, just looking at the amount of pitchers that were needed the last few years, even as a team that's competing.
So we'll talk about the pitching now, and we'll start with the players that we think are going to go north with the team. Name the initial pitching staff, rotation, and bullpen included.
Okay, I could do that. Let's go with, we know the rotation is some order of Zach Eflin, Grayson Rodriguez, Charlie Morton, Dean Kramer, and Tomoyuki Sugano. And we know the back end of the bullpen is pretty firmly set with Felix Bautista, Andrew Kittredge, Gregory Soto, Yunier Cano, Sir Anthony Dominguez, Cionel Perez, and Keegan Aiken. And then really, I think we're just looking at that last 8th bullpen spot as the one that could, unless they surprise with Keegan Aiken having options, maybe he struggles early or in spring, and they think he needs a little time to get right. He could start in AAA, but I'm not counting. I don't think that's likely. So right now, roster resource has Albert Suarez in that 8th and final spot. There was a nice article either today or yesterday about Suarez adding a sweeper / slurve to his mix to give something with a little more break, because a lot of his pitches last year were all 3 inches or less of movement on either direction, and this sweeper type of pitch will give potentially more swing and miss. I think maybe they want to see if that is an option, and he'll be right there in the bullpen if they need someone to step up and make a start potentially. I would love to see Colin Selby be that guy in the 8th spot, just because I'm a big fan. I think he's going to have a big year and make a name for himself in the Orioles bullpen. But it might have to be starting at AAA Norfolk for the season, just until they know what they're doing with Albert Suarez. Didn't have a great second half. In fact, had a poor second half. Didn't pitch as well out of the bullpen as he did as a starter. But give him a chance. I like I said earlier, this is not a team that just gives up on guys when they don't absolutely have to. So I think Albert Suarez will be given that chance to prove the doubters wrong, like Garrett in the Discord. So yeah, I think roster resource has it right. Vivek's asking Team Rodolfo Martinez. Yes, I am Team Rodolfo Martinez. I just think it might be a little bit later in the year when we get that train rolling.
So that's my 5-man rotation. Rodriguez, Eflin, Morton, Kramer, Sagano. And then for the bullpen, I have Bautista, Dominguez, Soto, Kittredge, Cano, Perez, Aiken, and Suarez. I do agree with you. I don't think the Orioles are going to move on from Albert Suarez just yet. And Andy Koska at the Baltimore Banner wrote a very good piece about the sweeper. That's what Bob was referring to a moment ago. That was published in the Baltimore Banner on Wednesday. We'll see whether or not that works out, but it's a clear sign that the Orioles know what Suarez's issue is, which is that he doesn't generate a lot of swings and misses, and that one of the biggest areas that could cause regression for him this year is that exactly. So I think they give him a little bit of time to work out of the bullpen to see if he can mix that pitch in. Not to mention, this is something that I think is worth pointing out, and I've brought it up before, but there are no scheduled off days for the Orioles over the first 2 weeks of the season. So I definitely don't think it hurts to have someone in the bullpen who has started recently that you could trust to go, hopefully you could trust to go 4 or 5 innings need be. So I do think that Suarez is going to be given a little bit of time out of camp to show what he can do, and that he will make the opening day roster.
Yeah, I like it.
Now, on a different note, which pitcher will have the best spring but not make the opening day roster?
This is a tough one because it's not just relievers we're talking about. I think we got Cade Povich here in this. We got Chase McDermott, and Brandon Young, maybe even some guys further down the list than that. Colin Selby, I think, is a good option to win this non-award. I'm going to go with Cade Povich. I have a hard time seeing him make the team, as much as I would love to see him earn that role, and really deserves a longer look in the rotation after the way he ended 2024 with like a 2.90 ERA, something like that in the last month, 5 starts of the season. But I think he's going to show improvement even in the spring. I think he's going to pitch well, but it's just going to be unless there's an injury or a trade, then I don't think there's really room for him. He will make double-digit starts for the Orioles this year. I just don't think it's going to be out of spring.
That was going to be my pick too, based on the way that he finished last year. He had a pretty good September, and I think that he kind of helped keep the rotation afloat down the stretch when other areas of the roster, in particular the lineup, were really struggling with the Orioles. And had they come into camp with Povich projected somewhere in the back end of their starting 5, I would not have been upset. I don't think it's a bad thing for him to go back to AAA early in the year, but I also would not have been upset if he had gone and made the team out of spring training this year. So since you talked about Povich, I will shout out Brandon Young. He had a really nice year last year, and he didn't have some of the major regression we've seen pitchers have in terms of command when he went from Bowie to Norfolk last year. Yes, the walks went up, but they didn't go up in a way that really stalled his development. He kind of went, stayed steady down the stretch last year. So that bodes well for him coming into this spring. I think he'll put together a couple of nice starts. He'll start the season out in Norfolk's rotation, and then maybe by Memorial Day we see him make his major league debut. And it's probably going to be one of those, game 2 of a doubleheader type of situations where he's brought up for a start and goes back to Norfolk. But I do think that a major league promotion is going to be around the corner for Brandon Young, at least within the first couple months of the season.
Yeah, I could certainly see that as well. If it wasn't for Chase McDermott's lat injury to start spring, which is slowing him down, I might have picked him for this because I think he's a guy with impressive stuff that I talked about on a recent Top 50 Countdown episode, that he can get batters to swing and miss, whether he's in the zone, out of the zone, and even when they make contact, it's weak. Batters do not square up the ball against Chase McDermott. So I was hoping for a fully healthy spring for him. Unfortunately, it'll have to wait. But yeah, plenty of options for this one.
We'll go now to one of our annual prediction prompts here on the show, and it's one of our favorites, and it is, who is this year's Jake Fox Award winner? And for those who aren't familiar with that reference, that refers to Jake Fox when he was in camp with the Orioles. What was that? Sometime in the early 2010s. Hit 7 home runs and was never heard from again, at least as far as the Orioles were concerned. So every year we try to come up with a guy that no one is talking about coming into camp, who's going to put up big numbers offensively and then have little to no major league time with the Orioles the following season. Last year, I had Daniel Johnson as Jake Fox Award winner, and I thought that worked out pretty well. So I'm going to try to repeat my success here again this year. But Bob, let's start with you.
All right, so I did some fact checking while you were reading the question and getting us into this. Wikipedia says on June 22nd, 2010, Fox was traded to the Baltimore Orioles for Ross Wolf in cash considerations. In spring training of 2011, he led the major leagues in home runs with 10, in extra base hits with 17. So it was 2011, and he hit 10 home runs. That's crazy. And he didn't make the team. Yeah, I'll go with Jordan Adams. I think this is a guy who's got silly power. He's not exactly a complete player. He's got some swing and miss, which is, I guess, why the Orioles are trying to take a flyer on him, because he was a great prospect at one point, and we feel like we can improve players' swing decisions and decrease their swing and miss, as we'll see with Judd Fabian and Vance Honeycutt are some of the bigger name projects on that. I think he'll run into like 3 home runs in the first couple weeks of spring, and people will be like, "Oh my God, Stuart Adams' character, is he gonna take Ramon Laureano's spot as that fifth outfielder?" And no, he won't. But I think he'll impress some people early on.
Yeah, that's my pick too, and I'm not even going to try to come up with another player because he just fits the mold so perfectly. He was a former top 100 prospect. In fact, Baseball Prospectus had him in their top 100 3 years in a row, 2019, 2020, 2021. And this is the kind of prospect that has failed in the Angels system repeatedly. Good raw power, but glaring swing and miss issues, kind of rust through the minor leagues a little bit. And just to get some perspective, Adams played in high A with Tri-City in 2021, and that was coming off the COVID year. The following year, he was at Double A and High A, and then he went to Triple A the next year. So he wasn't exactly rust through, but still made his major league debut at 23 years of age in 2023. Struggled to get a foothold at the major league level, and his numbers in Triple A have generally been solid, but not exactly eye-popping. And I think it's largely because of the swing and miss issues. But I think he'll have a good camp with the Orioles. And if you're a Norfolk Tides fan, I think you're going to have a lot of fun watching him this year because, if nothing else, you're going to have a little bit of power added to the Tides lineup. So, yeah, I'm definitely going to go with Adams, former first-round pick, former top 100 prospect. Let's see what he can do this spring.
Yeah, I believe he's still only 25 or 26. I think he's like about to turn 26. So interesting name. And remember Peyton Burdick? He was a lot of fun early 2024. I think Jordan Adams could be in a similar spot to Peyton Burdick in 2025.
Yep, Adams 25 years old, so still maybe some time for him to develop.
Yeah. And the Orioles love a project. We will say that.
Let's go to this last question, our last prediction, which is what will be the overall vibe coming out of spring training? And since you came up with this question, Bob, I want to get some clarification. Is this the vibe in Birdland at large, or the vibe in the clubhouse, or the vibe that we think is in the clubhouse?
Why not both? I was first going to say the fan vibes of the fans coming out of spring training, but then I saw the Red Sox vibes aren't very strong. I saw that Toronto vibes aren't very strong after they failed to sign Vlad to an extension, and he's dead set on becoming a free agent now after the season. And meanwhile, Rodolfo Martinez is dancing, and Adley Rushman's wearing wigs, and Colton Cowser's teaching you how to eat a Pop-Tart. Yeah, seems like the vibes are good right now anyway in Orioles spring training camp. And I expect that to continue as far as they're concerned. I think there are a lot of young players, get along, have fun playing the game. So vibes that way are going to be good. I even think that the vibes of the fan base is going to be better than it is now as we get closer to opening day, and the fact that we have a young, probably the best lineup in the American League coming into the season. I think the fans will get on board, at least to start the year. If there's any struggles early, then it could get ugly in Birdland. Not here. We're believers, but yeah, I think vibes are strong coming out of spring training.
Vibes will be good in the clubhouse coming out of camp. And they're not exactly going to come out and tell you if they're not good, but by all outward appearances, they will be good. And I think they actually will be good. As far as the fans go, I think there's going to be a lot of excitement around the lineup because I think that some of the concerns that hang over from the end of last season will be silenced a little bit. I think Adley's going to have a good spring. I think Gunner's going to do what
Best
Gunner
shape of his
does.
life.
And I think Jackson Holliday is also going to have a nice spring. So you take those three guys looking good in camp. Everything else at that point just kind of feels like a bonus. I do think you're still going to have the what about the rotation, and I think that those questions are valid right now. But I think the mood will be that one, everybody's excited that baseball is back, and two, we got this squad for now. Let's see what they can do. And I just hope that that's kind of where we are when we get out of spring.
I have one last thought, and not to end on a negative note, but to end on a negative note, who's gonna be the player or players that have a bad spring statistically, and fans are going to be worried, and ultimately it's not going to mean anything because spring training never does.
Well, that's a good one. I'll say that Ramon Urias does not have a good spring. And that will cause a lot of consternation because I feel like Ramon Urias, in fairness to him, I feel like he has to have a 900 OPS because that's what everybody has set for him is like, okay, you're blocking somebody, or I don't know why you're still on the roster. So you need to be 10 times the player you've always been. He's going to have a 700 to 740 OPS most years. That's just kind of who he is. I think Ramon Urias probably not going to have the best spring, and people are going to be worried about it. And I do think that at least early on, there's going to be a lot of worries about Felix Bautista because he's coming back from Tommy John surgery. He's trying to ramp himself up. And although everything that we have seen so far looks good, we can't expect him to come out of the gate 100%, certainly not at the beginning of camp, and probably not even at the beginning of the regular season. So I kind of feel like there's going to be some spring training version of his early appearances in the 2023 season. I remember he had a near blown save at Boston, and then I think he blew a save the next night. And then after that was dominant. But there was a little bit of concern early on, like, what's wrong with Felix Bautista? And then he got it right. I think that he's going to have an outing early on where he walks a few guys, maybe gives up a home run, and initially things don't look great, but then it's not going to matter because he's just going to go back to doing what he always does.
I like it. I was thinking Cedric Mullins, if he has a poor spring, he might get fans, because he had a rough first half in 2024. Fans are always ready to jump on Cedric Mullins' case. I could see that happening again. And for some reason, I'm picturing Tyler O'Neill, like with a week left before the season, having a 150 batting average with a 45% strikeout rate in spring. And then ultimately it doesn't matter. And he goes back to being Tyler O'Neill once the games start mattering again.
Yeah, I could definitely see that happening. So that does it for our spring training predictions. We're going to be back next week. And right now, we're slated to reveal our top 50 prospects countdown when we come back next week. We're going to do that probably in one episode. We're going to go 1 through 50 as we always do and break down our top 50 prospects. Of course, if you're a member of our Patreon community, you will know that before the main episode. But this is still an opportunity for us to talk about every player, not just go through the list 1 through 50, but for the three of us to talk about where we had some differences along the way. And that's not something that we've necessarily been able to give a perspective on during the Patreon episodes because we do those alone. But this is going to be an opportunity for us to talk about some players that we think could move up the list, where our lists were different. And there's going to be a lot of discussion. So you're not going to want to miss that. In the meantime, you can check us out on our many social media channels, including Facebook, Instagram, Threads, X, TikTok, YouTube, Blue Sky, and Twitch. We're also over at Substack, OriolesOnTheVerge.substack.com. And while you're browsing around the internet, be sure to head over to Patreon and become a member of our community. By the time this episode airs, our top 50 countdown will be on the brink of its completion, or maybe have even completed, but you could still sign up. Go back and listen to those episodes, and then look forward to a whole season worth of bonus coverage from Bob, Nick, and myself. So if you're not a member of our Patreon community, please consider signing up today at the $3, $5, or $10 levels. For Bob Phil and Nick Stevens, this is Zach Spedden. You've been listening to Orioles on the Verge, presented by BetOnline and part of the Believe Podcast Network.